My name is Sinfri Makoni. I'm a professor at Penn State University in the Department of Applied Linguistics and African Studies. And I'm also an extraordinary professor at University of the Northwest. When I was given the opportunity to address you on issues about language in pre-colonial Africa, my first feeling was that, oh yes, I could easily do this. But on close reflection, I quickly realized that there were a couple of problems. So I'll first of all talk about the problems, and then I'll illustrate how I went about addressing them. The first problem that I had was that the distinction between pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial Africa is an extremely difficult one to make. For example, when you say pre-colonial Africa, how far back do you want to go? And then two, that distinction also seems to some extent to be largely a Eurocentric based distinction in terms of how it conceptualizes and divides history. I then decided that no, possibly the way I should approach this is to look at the role of proverbs in pre-colonial Africa and how that might help me to understand the nature of the relationship between languages and society in pre-colonial Africa. But on close reflection, I quickly realized that there was no uniform description or agreement on what constituted a proverb and how it may differ from riddles and other artifacts. So I abandoned that. And after some time, I then said to myself that the only way I could go about this particular task is if I framed it theoretically. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to argue that when you're trying to address issues about the role of languages in society in pre-colonial Africa, it is important for you to articulate the framework that you are using to understand the nature of society, the nature of sociolinguistics, the nature of language, because that is the only way you can be able to talk meaningfully and sensibly about the nature of language in colonial Africa. So how do I conceptualize language and society in pre-colonial Africa? The framework that I decided to finally adopt is what is called integrationism, which was introduced by Roy Harris in 1980, 1981, 1998, and 2009. As a theory, it recognizes that there are three parameters which make up language, namely biomechanical, macrosocial, and circumstantial. The first of these three parameters, that is biomechanical, relates to the mental as well as to the physical abilities of each of the individual participants. The macrosocial parameter is related to well-established practices in the community of some group within the community. The third, that is the circumstantial parameter, relates to the specific conditions that arise in a particular communicative situation. Integrationist theory is critical of what it refers to as orthodox linguistics, which it describes as segregationist. In integrationism, the notion of language in Western linguistics is a myth, because it does not correspond to anything in social reality, but is rather a consequence of viewing language through what we call Riocentrism. Integrationism as an approach to language study is anathema to views of language as a fixed code, a hermetically sealed unit. The proposition that language is a myth is founded on psychocentric and Riocentric assumptions. In a psychocentric perspective, language can be described from a finite set of structures which have external validity. Although the claim is that language is a myth, we contend that that claim has social and real consequences. In integrationism, which is the framework that I'm going to use to try and address the issue about the nature of language in pre-colonial Africa, language is inextricably embedded in context of use, and meanings are achieved through continuous and dynamic negotiations a position which echoes views by other scholars whose work might be described in one form or other as reflective of integrationism. For example, the work by such theorists as Bazerman, Bakhtin, Latour, and Vygotsky. From an integrationist standpoint, segregationism makes a series of questionable distinctions. For instance, language is distinguished from context, linguistic knowledge from non-linguistic knowledge, content from form, language from action, learning language from life, language use from language learning. So when you ask somebody to try and look at the nature of language in pre-colonial Africa, what you are doing in a sense is you are grounding your assumptions through a segregationist perspective, which sees language as separate from context, use, learning, etc., which is something that I'm quite critical of. An integrationist approach is based on the assumption that the relationship between the name and the referent is stable. The naming of languages draws upon a segregationist perspective of naming. The counting of languages and the attribution of a number of speakers to a language assumes that the relationship between the name and its referent is stable and consistent. An example of an Eocentric approach to language is the ethnologue. Naming of languages masks the possibilities of variation in naming, in that people may have different understanding of the referent. For example, what one person may understand and construe as English, Swahili, and French may differ between people. Irrespective of the limitations of Eocentrism, naming is part of the discourse of othering. Naming languages began with foreigners literate in Arabic and European languages. Traders, explorers, and colonizers wanted to know the people they were dealing with. Because the names were assigned by outsiders, these names did not necessarily correspond with how the speakers might have referred to the language they spoke, or more importantly, how they experienced themselves socio-communicatively. Nonetheless, labeling or naming of these objects, which are now called languages, had sociolinguistic consequences because of their ethno-linguistic significance. Yet the act of naming was critically important because it made it possible to manage languages as objects of promotion, planning, maintenance, and teaching. The naming of languages not only created a new category of identity, but also complexities with regard to African identities. For example, if you speak Zulu, you are Zulu. The naming of languages produced puzzling questions such as, what languages do you speak? As opposed to the typical African language question, do you speak? Which on its own suggests that names of languages are not part of the lexicon of these speakers. This indicates that languages among lowly literate Africans are conceptualized without necessarily positing the existence of languages as spatially, ethnically bounded entities, or without cutting language up into different units. In realizing the limitations of the discrete code conceptualizations of language, some researchers have begun to suggest the notion of hybridization to account for the way the colonial and post-colonial individuals interacted. However, the notion of hybridization does not resolve the problem of a coded discrete entity, because it is indeed predicated on an assumption that there exist two codes or separate entities which are combined. Pluralization of singularity and singularization of plurality. Expositions about language are further complicated because there is no semantic equivalent of the term language in African languages, as in other traditional societies, such as among the Australian Aborigines. In Nguni languages, the equivalent of language is human speak, Isintu, or human language, Chivanu, in Shona. The term language may be used to refer to ways of speaking, perhaps equivalent to register, style, genre, etc. The notion of language in African societies is further complicated because the concept language is construed differently depending upon local context. For example, unlike in segregationist linguistics, in Africa it is difficult to make objective statements about language across historical and social spaces. Hence the unanswerability of the question, what was the nature of language in pre-colonial Africa? In integrationism, it is not necessary to identify universal criteria for defining languages, dialects, etc. For example, the word languages in Cameroon refers to French and English. This is abstract entities which have currency in university language departments and academic papers, not what primary school teachers call patois or dialect. Since Africans cannot be separated from their lineage, naming one's language is not an objective act, but a set of communicative resources which are intricately interwoven with individual and social identities. From such a perspective, it is not necessary to construe language and identity as separate. Western academic discourse conceptualizes local languages in a plural form as the sum of a number of distinct languages. It engages in a pluralization of singularity. In a pluralization of singularity, languages are enumerable, separable, and nameable. The ethnologue is an example par excellence of such an approach in which languages can be enumerated. On the other hand, exponents of a local discourse of language in education and language in a colonial era might have been a characteristic feature of what we can call the singularization of plurality.
I'm an emeritus professor of sociology from the University of the Western Cape. It was my last place of work. I've worked in about 9 countries in Africa, 3 in Europe, 1 in Asia. Over a period, I started teaching in 1969 in Heidelberg, in Germany. Well, since 1997, when I retired from the University of the Western Cape, I started a center called the Center for Advanced Studies of African Society in Cape Town for the whole of Africa, doing work mainly in anthropological linguistics, specifically questions related to the harmonization and standardization of orthographic conventions of African languages. So that now I retired from that position 2 years ago, donated the institute to the University of the Western Cape, by which time we had covered about 80 to 85% of African languages. Yes, so this is what I've been doing, and lately I'm still busy with anthropological linguistics, but mainly busy with questions of orality and literacy, and the impact of literacy on oral societies. Following up discussions, basically they're discussions which have been bandied about since the 50s, the late 50s. And that is what I've been doing lately. I got a fellowship in Cambridge University to look at the problems of periodization of African history. And in my latest writings about decolonizing education, those are the issues I'm raising, that we have to stop looking at ourselves as if we are either pre-colonial, colonial, or post-colonial. In other words, our whole being in history revolves around the colonial interlude, which is no more than 100 years, 150 years in African history of 100,000 years of Homo sapiens in Africa. Now, the relationship between languages and societies in pre-colonial Africa, the question raises a huge issue, a huge epistemological issue, which has not been so far sufficiently discussed. Problem is that when we say pre-colonial, what do we mean? Do we mean 1,000 years? Do we mean 100 years? Do we mean 2,000 years? Do we mean 500 years? And of course, language over these periods I have just mentioned changes all the time. And so we will have arbitrarily to specify more concretely which period in African history we're talking about when we say pre-colonial. We shouldn't just take it for granted that pre-colonial is a fixed period which everybody accepts. If we say pre-colonial is the period, or for our purposes today, the period just before the beginnings of colonialism in Africa, then we can say that before colonialism in Africa, languages were largely, of course, non-Western. Languages of social intercourse and social transaction, all indigenous languages, all non-Western, non-European languages. Now, those languages defined peoples, historical, cultural groups. And these groups were politically marked by their languages, the language it is used and spoke. So that the definition of who a person is was more based on cultural, linguistic criteria than arbitrary political, geographical demarcations. That's one thing we can say.
Good day. I am Bernard Mbenga, a professor of history at Northwest University, Mafeking campus, where I retired formally in December 2017, having taught there for exactly 30 years. I am still at Northwest University as extraordinary professor until December 2021. Apart from supervising 3 postgraduate students, I am also putting together 2 book manuscripts, one on class and social status in pre-colonial Botswana societies, scheduled for publication at the end of 2021. Another book manuscript, The Leisure Activities of Pre-Colonial Botswana Societies, is completed. Having given some clarity towards understanding the term pre-colonial in the African, especially Southern African context, I now move on to a few practical aspects about language in pre-colonial African society. In pre-colonial African society, the issues of ethnicity and language were a lot more fluid than they came to be much later, even if ethnic labels were used. A good example is the pre-colonial Bapedi Kingdom in what is today Mpumalanga province, where in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s, the kings Sekwati and after him Sekukune brought together various Bafokeng, Mfengu, Northern Sutu, and Nguni people, all under the umbrella name Bapedi. These various groups came from different ethnicities, and origins, but they were all wielded together into one people called Bapedi, who spoke Sepedi. They became one people, the Bapedi, who paid allegiance to one authority, that is Sekwati, followed by Sekukune. So here, language became a unifying factor, while the previous particularities of origins and ethnicities no longer mattered. Another example is the pre-colonial kingdom of Basutoland. Now, King Moshoeshoe, during his nation-building endeavors, brought together small groups from a variety of chiefdoms, which were spread over many parts of what would become South Africa, including some of the Korana and others of racially mixed descent. King Moshoeshoe chose the term Sutu to call his very diverse peoples whose previous identities gave way to a national Pan-Sutu identity unified by the Sesotho language. In the Upper Caledon River Valley, many of the Boers, in fact, saw themselves as Moshoeshoe's subjects, and they spoke Sesotho just as they spoke Afrikaans. Now, from these two pre-colonial examples of Basotho and Bapedi, we can see that ethnic labels were unimportant. They were not an issue, unlike today. Instead, it was a language, a lingua franca, that was important. In that manner, therefore, language became a unifier. In the 19th century, many communities of different origins and different ethnicities interacted with one another through trade, through intermarriage, and through war. In all these kinds of interaction, language played an important role. Now let us go to another pre-colonial setting. Around the junction of the Harts and Far rivers were the Batlaping people of Chief Mahura. All around the Batlaping were the Korana and the Griqua, both of whom spoke Afrikaans. In that region in the 1830s, as the historian Paul Landau tells us, the Griqua and the Korana people developed a non-racial Christian elite who were a conglomeration of speakers of Setswana, Khoisan, and Dutch languages. Both the Korana and the Griqua also spoke Setswana. So, in a very real sense, language was again a unifier.
Hello, I'm Diana Jeter. I'm Emeritus Professor of African History at the University of the West of England, Bristol, and I'm Associate Dean Education currently in the School of Histories, Languages and Cultures at the University of Liverpool. My teaching is called African history, which is a thing in British universities, but obviously that's far too wide a field to be meaningful. And in practice, I broadly teach late 19th century and early 20th century cultural history. My research is fundamentally about decolonizing the academy. In a lifetime of studying African history and specifically Zimbabwean history, I've realized that the ways in which we frame our research questions and the dominance of English in writing the history of Zimbabwe is entirely framed by the European Enlightenment. And this restricts how we can write history. So my interests are in trying to understand how that process happened and to provide some insight into what a history that went beyond the concepts of the European Enlightenment might begin to look like. When you ask me what is the relationship between languages and society in pre-colonial African societies, my expertise is based on Zimbabwe and specifically on Shona-speaking communities. And the first thing that one would say is that, as always, language is a way of communicating power relationships, and the words that it's permissible to use when speaking to somebody else is a way of indicating the power relationship between those people. So the words that relatives use in relationship to one another will indicate where they stand in terms of kinship hierarchies, for example. And I think it's really important to note that kinship relationships underpin an enormous amount of the signaling about who people are and what their identity is, far more really than the languages that they're using. There are huge connections across the Southern African region between people with broadly similar, what in English we'd call totems, and that understanding how those work and how they frame the way in which language is used between groups is very important. And of course, much of that is not understood in the classic linguistics that emerges in the early 20th century when there are attempts to define the language groups that the societies that have been colonized spoke. There are power relationships between language groups as well, and I think it's important to bear that in mind. So, for example, before the whites come in and occupy what we would now call eastern Zimbabwe, there had been a previous Nguni invasion by what was known as the Gaza Empire. And the language that those people spoke, which has come down to us as Shangaan, which is linked to Zulu and can be mutually understood by Zulu speakers, Shangaan was a more powerful language in that it was the language of the overlords than the local version of what we'd now call Shona, which is Ndau. And this had important consequences for when whites came in as well, because whites adopted those power relationships and were keener to use Zulu words than Shona words when defining local important cultural things like bride wealth. They preferred to say lobola than to say rora, because they were, for a whole variety of cultural reasons and historical reasons, they were more rooted in a Zulu-derived understanding of local languages than they were in a Shona understanding of local languages. So that wasn't something just invented by the whites, it was something that pre-existed, and I think it's very important for us to bear in mind that a lot of the ways in which whites defined themselves vis-a-vis Africans was influenced in part by pre-existing power relationships, which were also reflected in which languages were seen as having more status than others.
Also say that the process of socialization, which includes education, is the adaptation of people to become normative members of a society. That in that process, the language utilized was invariably the language of the mother tongue, language which the person utilized at home, the language of the father and the mother, and the home situation, basically. Two, these languages were very powerful in the socialization and the education formation of the people. Because formal education was limited to age sets, and to the graduation, in other words, of people from one level of growth to the other, from adolescence to youth, to adulthood, and the rites of passage which marked these transitions. These are junctions which included the use of language and cultures to form and demarcate one generation from the other. In other words, the languages, the African languages, were all-encompassing in the formation of the person. It was what the Germans would call the Bildung of the person, the formation, the social formation of the person. Now, that we can say, because if you put that in contrast with what happened under colonialism, what happened under colonialism was that up and above these mother tongue languages was imposed another language, a language of power, of superior power, political, economic, social power. So, in a sense, these were some of the principal contours of the demarcations culturally, which marked the pre-colonial period.
When you ask me what is the relationship between language and education in pre-colonial societies, then I'm afraid then I want to trouble the question, if we're troubling history. I have problems with that word education because I'm not sure what we mean by it. When we use a word in English, that we're referring to something that's going on prior to English being used. This is something I'm looking at all the time. When whites talk about education or development, and they use that in the early part of the white occupation, well, actually throughout the white occupation, and in interventions even today, we're told that we're bringing education to African societies and that this justifies what whites are doing. This raises the question then of what does education mean? And I think the word is packed with a whole set of assumptions that don't necessarily apply to pre-colonial societies. And of course, this is important because when we look historically at the first generations of white occupation, when whites first come into, say, Zimbabwe, where I'm working on, and say, we are here to bring development, civilization, education, there is not a meaningful way to translate that into local languages. So any conversation with people, local people, about that process, or when local people say, well, we want education, I'm not sure that we have any way of knowing what that means, because the words that were used by the whites to translate that word education were, of course, words that already existed in Shona society, but they meant something completely different in Shona society. They mean, what is it that we want our children to know so that they can be effective adults, which is broadly what the word means in English as well. But the reality of what those refer to in concrete terms are, of course, entirely different. And so when whites say, we bring education, or we want your children to come to us to be educated, and the words that they use are the words that are used in pre-colonial society to refer to a completely different kind of process, then we have to ask what kind of communication is taking place here. And then we have the question, well, how do we know about the relationship between society, language, education in pre-colonial times? Well, where are we getting that data from? And very often that data is coming to us through a mediation of translation, where we can't really be sure that what we are understanding by it is what was actually going on in the pre-colonial society. So before I can even begin to answer questions about relationships between language and education in pre-colonial society, I think that we need to decolonize the terms that we're using and not to assume that education has some kind of universal translation, because it doesn't.
I think what we should, the principal thing we must learn is that language makes a person more than anything else. Language defines a culture. Language provides identity for people. It is often the case now that people talk about identities in terms of biologies. How a person looks like, how the color of his eyes, the color of the head, the texture of the hair, the color of the skin. Well, these are all biological features which have no cultural content. They cannot really be definitional in who we are. Who we are is more linked with cultural things, and of the cultural elements in society, language is the principal feature. Language is the principal. In other words, if a child is born in northern India and is brought to Tierra del Fuego in South America as a baby, he will grow up behaving exactly like the other people from Tierra del Fuego, not like an Indian from North India. It's as simple as that. It's very, very simple. And therefore, it is important for us to give the significance and the importance of language the centrality it deserves. The centrality it deserves in our lives, and the importance and significance it has for the formation of people, pride in themselves, respect for themselves, and the ability to grow up confidently in societies. That is why it is important that African languages are made for African families and African people, the center of their educational process. And until we do that, there is no hope for decolonization.
So then, what are the lessons for South Africa today to learn about language from all these pre-colonial contexts which I have just outlined to you? First, the ethnic backgrounds of groups, individuals, and their labels were not an issue. They were not important. What mattered instead was their common allegiance to a central authority. So you had the Pedi king, the Sutu king. If we too in South Africa today can learn and think along these lines, we would build a much better South Africa, which would be socially cohesive and much more united.
What we can learn from looking at these pre-colonial societies, of course, partly depends on who we are. And the academy is often a very different we from the people in the society at large. So I think what can be learned depends very much on where one is situated in the first place. The grassroots often knows things that the academy reaches by very circuitous routes. But as an academic, when I ask what can I learn about this, it's really for me about what questions does it enable me to ask? What questions does it make clearer that weren't so visible before? When we look at language groups and groupings in pre-colonial societies, what we see is fuzzy boundaries. We see, certainly as I mentioned previously, we see that, say, Shangaan became a language that was attractive to Ndau men because it gave them status. But if you look at Shangaan, Zulu, Xhosa, Ndebele, what we've got here are languages that the edges are not clear. And similarly, they spill over into other Bantu languages in the region. When people were moving around and trading within the region, they weren't crossing clearly marked lines on the ground that said you're stepping here from one language group to another language group. And we know that languages work like this. But what has happened historically is that in the early 20th century, linguists, and particularly Clement Doak, were brought in to draw the lines on the map, to say, here be Shona speakers, here be Ndebele speakers, and then subdivide those into, in Shona, here are Zulu speakers, here are Chandal speakers. And these were quite literally lines on the map. And that tells us about how power was very much about defining and fixing African societies. So when we look at pre-colonial societies, we see much more fluidity. And that fluidity, I think, is immensely valuable. Fluidity is one of the things that we see very much both in pre-colonial societies and in language, that the thinking of the Academy and the European Enlightenment really struggles with. We see it in the practice of law, for example, in pre-colonial societies, where it's all about negotiation and continuing negotiation. It isn't the fixed guilty, not guilty that is part of European systems of law. And it isn't about punishment. It's about getting people to talk together and reconcile and compensate. And I think what we find by looking at these relationships in pre-colonial societies is the possibility for more fluidity. So the questions that these studies raise for me is, how can we see more clearly the fixity, the boundaries, the rigidity of taxonomy and categorization in post-colonial modes of thinking by comparing them with the fluidity that is inherent in the ways in which people used language in the pre-colonial period. And linked to that, there's the not just in the pre-colonial period, but currently there is the agility of Bantu languages. There is the gender neutrality of Bantu languages, which the Academy could learn a lot from, of recognizing that it's possible to say things in other ways, which, with our obsession with using European languages to write histories, we lose some of the other ways of expressing complex ideas that African languages have.